Hey guys, tonight we journey somewhere quieter than the battlefield, more fragile than the clang of armor, and a little stranger than your typical samurai tale. You're walking into a world where cherry blossoms fall with intent, where men in lacquered armor whisper stanzas, and where one very particular warrior would rather write a haiku than swing a katana. Yes, you're about to spend a sleepy evening in feudal Japan, following the footsteps of a soft spoken samurai whose legacy lives not in bloodshed, but in brushstrokes. And look, if you're here expecting dramatic sword fights and war cries, you might be in the wrong dojo. This story moves at the speed of a tea kettle coming to boil, and honestly, that's the whole point. You probably won't survive this if you're looking for fast paced action, but if you're ready to unwind and float gently through poetic history, you're in the right room. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing who's drifting off with me around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake before the sun, long before the bustle of Edo's outer roads, in a house that smells faintly of cedar and ink. Tatami mats cushion your steps as you move past sliding shoji doors into a garden veiled in morning mist. A single cherry tree stands at its center, its blossoms trembling under the weight of dew. Beneath it kneels a young man in pale robes, silent, motionless except for the flick of his wrist as he writes. Not a report, not a war plan, a poem. 5 syllables, 7, then 5 again. That ancient rhythm, the same cadence as a breath drawn and let go. He writes slowly, reverently, as if each character is a droplet falling onto the still surface of a pond. Around him, the world holds its breath. This is not the samurai you expected. He was born Tozen no Ietsuna, heir to a minor warrior family on the fringes of Japan's political heartbeat. The sword was meant to be his inheritance, passed from his grandfather's scorched grip to his own clean hands. But even at 8, Ietsuna seemed to reach for the brush before the blade. His early tutors thought him weak. One even claimed he looked at clouds too often, as if that were a defect, and not a declaration of curiosity. His mother quietly encouraged the habit. At dusk, when his father was away drilling retainers, she would unroll an old anthology of poems from the Heian court. They'd sit by the fire, reading aloud verses from Lady Murasaki and Saigyo the monk. Sometimes she would make him memorize them, not for discipline, but because she believed that beautiful words shaped the spine more than harsh orders ever could. By 10, Ietsuna could recite stanzas most grown men hadn't heard in years. He quoted Basho more easily than Confucius, and when left alone, he'd copy old poems onto scraps of mulberry paper and tuck them into crevices, behind beams, under pots, inside the folds of rice paper screens, not to hide them, to give them space to breathe. Still, tradition loomed. A samurai's life was structured martial training in the morning, lessons in rhetoric and governance by midday, patrol duties or scroll copying by evening. Ietsuna did all of it, but always with that same distant look, as if he were living between lines of verse. His calligraphy instructor noticed this first. His brush does not obey his hand, he muttered once. It listens to his heart. And though the adults around him whispered concerns, the truth was he was excellent at the blade, natural, even. His strikes were precise, his footwork silent. But there was something unnerving about how little joy he took in it, as if he were waiting for the match to end so he could get back to his inkstone. He preferred long walks, not for fitness, but for observation. There were entire afternoons where he'd simply trace the banks of the Kamo River, following the shadows of reeds and watching carp flash beneath the surface. One winter, when the world was gray and bitter, he noted in his private scroll the snow falls without needing permission. I hope to write like that one day. Historians still argue whether Ietsuna ever intended to fully abandon the way of the warrior, or if he hoped to harmonize the two paths. Some see his life as rebellion, others as refinement. What's certain is that he managed to keep both lives breathing, one through his sword arm, the other through the ink-stained sleeve of his riding robes. And then came the cherry tree. It was planted the year his brother died, another young warrior fallen in a border skirmish no one remembers. Yatsuna never cried. Instead, he returned from the funeral, requested a spade, and dug a hole with his bare hands into it. He lowered a sapling he'd been tending in secret every spring after. He sat beneath it and wrote a new poem, never to be published, just offered to the blossoms. One fragment survived, copied by a house servant who glimpsed the page before it was burned. He left before the plum buds opened, so I wait. Alone with green tea, a decade later, he would inscribe a similar verse on the hilt of his own katana, not in gold, in faded lacquer, visible only when the blade was drawn at just the right angle, under just the right light. Most never saw it, but a few did, and they remembered. By the time Yatsuna turned 18, he had already written over 400 poems, none of them published, none submitted to the official poetry contests that many young noblemen used to gain favor. He wasn't interested in climbing the court's literary ladders. He was more interested in capturing the texture of moss on a stone, or the silence between falling raindrops. His father, Lord Ietomo, struggled with this publicly. He praised his son's sword skills privately. He worried about the way Ietsuna avoided court banquets, ignored offers from prominent clans for marriage alliances, and spent too much time tending bonsai trees or rearranging pebbles in the garden. A samurai, Lord Ietomo once grunted, should cut more than flower stems, but Ietsuna had no desire to defy his father outright. He obeyed his duties, bowed when required, accepted his training. He just added things. After completing his sword drills, he would remain behind to sweep the practice yard, not out of obligation, but to listen to the wind during night patrols. He would pause to jot down a few lines beneath lanterns at council meetings. He doodled kanji variations in the margins of his scrolls. His peers didn't quite know what to do with him. Some admired his quiet intensity, others mocked it. One rival dubbed him the paper samurai, a nickname meant to humiliate, but which Ietsuna took as a compliment. After all, what's more durable in memory, a single swing of a sword, or a stanza that lingers for centuries still? There were moments he had to play the part expected of him. In one particularly tense year, when a minor uprising sparked in a neighboring province, Yatsuna was dispatched alongside a retinue to maintain order. He wore armor, carried his blade, and followed orders. But he also carried a travel-sized inkstone tucked into a silk pouch under his breastplate. During one stop at a village shrine, while others inspected the storehouses, he wandered behind the altar and sat beneath a camphor tree. There, using a torn scrap of parchment and a bit of water from the offering basin, he wrote, "Even the crow pauses, rice fields stilled by winter hush, blade sheathed in frostlight, it would later be found, pressed between the pages of a temple record book, its author unnamed, but the handwriting, firm, flowing, unmistakable, was his." One of the strangest episodes from his early adult life, and one historians still puzzle over, was the infamous 10 verses tournament. This was not a literal battle, of course, but a poetry contest hosted by a high-ranking court noble, Lord Hayashi, who had a reputation for attracting eccentric samurai artists. Yatsuna was invited, and against his usual instincts, he agreed to attend. The competition rules were simple: 10 warriors, 10 rounds, 1 verse each, no repeated themes, but the tone turned unexpectedly combative when one participant, a boastful general named Saburo, mocked Yatsuna for being more geisha than guard, rather than respond with insult. Yatsuna waited until his next verse, with a calm voice and barely a glance at Saburo. He recited ink runs like blood does, yet one dries beneath the moon, the other in dust. The room went silent. No applause, no rebuttal, just the uncomfortable realization that sometimes the sharpest cuts leave no wound. That poem, according to one surviving diary, spread quietly through the capital in the weeks that followed. It was copied in secret by courtiers, scratched into fan handles, murmured in tea houses, and while it did not ruin Saburo's career, it did mark a shift. Yatsuna, for the first time, was feared not for his blade, but for the precision of his words. And yet, he never seemed particularly interested in fame. When a scribe from a Kyoto literary guild came requesting copies of his work for publication, Yatsuna declined gently. "A poem," he said, "is not a fish to be salted and sold. It is more like incense, meant to vanish." Some scholars today argue that this resistance to fame was part of a deeper philosophy Yatsuna developed, a kind of poetic bushido. Rather than reject samurai life, he reimagined it for him. True strength lay not in domination, but in restraint. Mastery was not proven by taking life, but by observing it so closely that you could express its smallest tremors. One surviving letter to a fellow poet hints at this belief. "They tell me," he writes, "that a man's worth is counted in victories, but I have seen the plum tree endure 3 frosts and still bloom. It made no noise, it left no bodies, and yet I remember it more clearly than any battle." This quiet conviction began to draw like-minded individuals to him, other warrior poets who struggled to reconcile violence with beauty. They exchanged letters, met discreetly at moon-viewing parties, and began collecting each other's works, often under pseudonyms to avoid political entanglements. One called himself Sword Without Sound, another signed only as Rain Behind the Eaves. Some modern historians debate whether this was a formal movement or just scattered individuals sharing kindred thoughts. But one thing is clear: Yatsuna's influence was growing, not as a warrior, but as something rarer, a model of deliberate gentleness in a world obsessed with dominance. Even his family began to shift. His younger sister, once destined for a political marriage, instead became a calligraphy teacher. His father, though never fully approving, stopped pushing him toward a military governorship, and his aging tutor, once critical of Ietsuna's passivity, asked to be buried with a scroll of his poetry folded into his sleeve. There's a story, likely apocryphal but too poetic to ignore, that on his 25th birthday, Ietsuna was offered a ceremonial sword engraved with the clan motto. He accepted it politely, then wrapped it in rice paper covered in poems, tied it with woven grass, and placed it on a shrine shelf next to an incense burner. He never once drew it. You rise early again, another hazy dawn, and find him already in the courtyard. He moves in slow arcs, practicing sword forms not with aggression, but with the same grace you'd expect from someone pouring tea. The blade carves through mist more than air, silent as breath. You watch as he completes a final cut, then lowers the weapon gently, almost apologetically. There's no shout, no stomp, no flourish, just a bow toward the east, where the sun hasn't yet cracked the clouds. He turns, picks up a folded cloth from a nearby bench, and begins to polish the blade, not to keep it sharp, but to keep it clean, as one would with a favorite ink brush. The servants have learned to stay quiet around him during these rituals, not out of fear, out of reverence, and perhaps a little confusion. One of the gardeners once remarked, Ietsuna Dono draws his sword like he's afraid it might bruise the air. Another, bolder, muttered, it's hard to tell if he's practicing killing or praying. This blend of ritual and restraint became something of his signature. He never skipped sword training. He just repurposed it. Where others sparred to toughen themselves, he sparred to measure silence. Where others aimed for power, he aimed for stillness. And when he struck, it was as if he were conducting an orchestra, not preparing for war. This had effects, some expected, some strange. First, he became sought after, not just by poets and quiet nobles, but by younger samurai confused by their place in a world that demanded they be both scholars and killers. They'd sneak into his garden during off hours, pretending to admire the azaleas, only to ask questions that had nothing to do with horticulture. Does one ever feel clean after battle? Is there honor in not drawing your sword? Can a man write of moonlight and still be respected? He answered each carefully, never preachy, never vague, always thoughtful. A clean heart is not the same as a clean blade, he said once, adjusting a young student's grip, but sometimes one leads to the other. Then came the issue of expectations. His peers began to notice that he was consistently ranked among the top in swordsmanship evaluations, yet he rarely fought, even in simulated duels. He often stepped aside at the last second, or let his opponent's momentum carry them into a harmless miss. Why don't you finish it? One shouted in frustration after a public match. Ietsuna only bowed. Because I already know the ending, he said. His superiors didn't know whether to reprimand him or promote him. One lord called him a ghost in armor. Another, more literary, dubbed him the quiet thundercloud, a compliment that Ietsuna found so pleasing he wrote it on a lantern. But not everyone was impressed. Some hardened warriors viewed his gentleness as dangerous. One elder retainer claimed that a samurai who hesitates weakens the spine of the clan. He lobbied for Ietsuna to be reassigned to a coastal outpost, far from the capital, far from influence, but before the decision was made, something strange happened. A visiting monk, known for his debates on Buddhist ethics and Zen swordsmanship, arrived at court and requested a demonstration from the young poet warrior. Ietsuna obliged, leading him to a private dojo with no audience. The monk bowed. Ietsuna bowed. They sparred in silence for nearly an hour. No one ever learned the exact outcome. But afterward, the monk left behind a single written line before returning to his temple. He carries a sword the way monks carry bells, not to strike, but to remind. That scroll was displayed quietly in the main hall for months. The reassignment order was quietly dropped. Meanwhile, in his private quarters, Ietsuna expanded his practice. He'd begun creating hybrid scrolls, verses woven between diagrams of sword strikes, ink paintings of birds accompanying footwork instructions. It wasn't schoolbook material, but some of his more open-minded students cherished them. A few such scrolls have survived, stored today in obscure corners of museum archives, often mislabeled as anonymous Edo-era sketches. His philosophy even found its way into fashion in the subtlest sense. While most samurai wore dark, intimidating robes of navy or blood red, Ietsuna often appeared in soft browns, river grays, or faded plum, colors that matched the seasons rather than the battlefield. His armor, too, though functional, was devoid of golds or clan emblems. Instead, it bore a single stitched leaf on the chest plate in near invisible thread. When asked about it once, he replied, "The leaf falls, but the tree remains. That is enough symbol for me." Historians still debate whether Ietsuna's conduct reflected a personal quirk or a larger commentary on the contradictions of the samurai class. Was he simply eccentric, or was he deliberately reshaping the narrative of what it meant to be a warrior? Some argue he was a pacifist in disguise. Others suggest he was the ultimate expression of the Bushido code, someone who had mastered violence so completely he could afford to set it down. A few fringe scholars even theorize that Ietsuna suffered from something akin to battle fatigue, inherited not from combat, but from generations of expectation. What's certain is this: his influence was starting to shift things. At a time when most samurai sought to etch their names in history through conquest, he was quietly reshaping his world through gentleness, reflection, and subtle contradiction. One scholar later described him as a ripple in a pond large enough to disturb the mountain's reflection. Even today, in some dojos that favor both martial and literary training, there exists a quiet tradition, the morning verse. Before practice begins, students are invited to write a single line, a thought, a feeling, an image, not to be judged, not to be remembered, just to remind themselves that the hand that holds the sword is also capable of tenderness, and whether they realize it or not. That tradition began with Ietsuna, the samurai who never shouted, the warrior who apologized to falling leaves, the poet who made silence into armor. The seasons change again, and with them, the rhythms of the estate. You wander through Ietsuna's home on a quiet afternoon. No clatter of armor, no shrill bark of orders, just the steady murmur of wind through bamboo and the distant patter of someone practicing flute beneath the veranda, somewhere nearby. Water flows into a small stone basin, tsukubai, feeding moss. Not ambition, inside the study. You find him kneeling by an open window. His katana rests beside him, unsheathed but untouched. In his lap is a worn parchment covered in tiny kanji, ink so fine it's almost whispering off the page. He's editing, not a battle report, but a hoku about plum blossoms blooming too early. One line troubles him. He rewrites it twice, then once more, then finally, with a satisfied nod, folds the scroll into thirds and tucks it beneath the floorboards. You're not sure why he hides it, but then again, not everything needs to be explained aloud. To understand Yatsuna's worldview, you have to understand the code he lived by, a modified version of Bushido, if you can imagine such a thing, where traditional samurai values emphasized loyalty, courage, and honor unto death. Yatsuna's personal creed added something softer: patience, deliberation, mercy. Not the mercy that spares enemies, but the kind that spares oneself from becoming hardened. He once wrote in a letter to a distant cousin, Bushido teaches us to meet death calmly, but I think it more difficult and more noble to meet spring without bitterness. And this tension between duty and poetry was something he explored daily. Each sword kata in his hands became a meditation, each poem a discipline. He refused to separate the two. One of his most unusual practices involved silent walks through the estate grounds each evening. No lantern, no escort, just him, barefoot, pacing the stone paths and pausing periodically to stare at a leaf, a crack in the wall, or the shadow of a tree limb stretching across gravel. He'd carry a small notebook during these walks, though sometimes he returned without having written a single word. "Why do you walk so late?" a maid once asked. He smiled, because the moon doesn't speak during the day. Not everyone was charmed. As his fame as a poet grew, despite his best efforts to avoid it, so too did the resentment of more orthodox samurai. To them, he was an unsettling figure too gentle to trust, too popular to ignore. Rumors circulated that he was secretly a monk, that he refused to kill, that he had vowed celibacy to protect his poetic mind, that his blade was deliberately dulled. None of it was true, or rather, some of it might have been, but no one ever confirmed it. He answered none of the gossip. He simply kept writing. There was, however, one very real moment that thrust him into the public eye in a way he never invited. A young noble, brash, heavily armed, drunk on either rice wine or reputation, challenged him to a duel in the town square. The crowd gathered fast. Such things were rare now, but still legal. No one expected Yatsuna to show up, but he did, unarmored, unhurried, wearing his walking robes and a single hairpin in his topknot. When the noble demanded he draw, Yatsuna refused. He bowed, then recited a poem instead. Why raise dust for pride, when wind will scatter all names before the bell chimes? The crowd laughed, nervously. The noble turned red, then white, then tried to strike him anyway, in one swift motion. Yatsuna stepped aside, tapped the man's wrist with the sheath of his sword, and disarmed him without unsheathing his blade. Gasps. Silence. He bowed again. Perhaps your blade and my poem can sit together for tea someday. He walked away. That story, half fact, half fable, spread like wildfire. It made its way into travel songs, tea house gossip, and eventually, a no play that dramatized the scene with a bit more rain and a conveniently timed cherry blossom fall. Ietsuna never commented on it. When asked, he merely said, "If a story grows sweeter in the retelling, let it grow." Historians still argue whether that duel really happened exactly as described. One scholar insists the noble was paid to provoke Ietsuna as a test of character. Another claims the story was invented entirely by a rival clan to make their own samurai seem more brutish by comparison. But one small piece of evidence tilts the balance in favor of truth: a broken hairpin, lacquered with a single falling leaf, found in a street-side gutter the next morning. What set Ietsuna apart from other warrior poets of the time was his consistency. Many men flirted with literature, few lived it. He didn't write when inspired. He wrote daily, even when tired, bored, or full of doubt. One surviving scroll contains 14 failed versions of the same verse about an autumn crow, each one slightly different, like ripples widening from a single tossed stone. He never published a collection in his lifetime. He gave poems away freely to servants, to travelers, to a local papermaker. He once spent an hour helping select reeds. A poem, he often said, is a breath you give to someone else, best if it vanishes after doing its work. One servant recalled finding dozens of them folded into paper cranes, left anonymously around the estate. Some were humorous, jokes about aging, or critiques of the cook's overly salted rice. Others were heartbreakingly tender, especially those written after the death of his old tutor. One read, "You told me to cut, but never said when to stop. I still wait for that. In the long afternoons, when not tending to the garden or teaching younger samurai how to walk quietly." He took to restoring damaged scrolls, not rewriting them, restoring. He'd clean the silk, patch the tears, trace missing kanji with steady care. To preserve words is to preserve ghosts. He once explained to a confused apprentice. His gentle habits extended even to his diet. He refused to eat meat on days he wrote poetry, claiming it made his hand shake. Whether that was superstition or simply another form of self-discipline, no one knew. But the kitchen always prepared separate meals for him: pickled plum, seaweed, white rice, and always a bowl of miso with floating tofu cubes shaped like clouds. And so, he lived, half in the world of tradition, half in a whisper-thin layer of beauty he laid over everything like a silk veil. You could almost forget he still carried a sword. There's a gentle drizzle this morning, the kind that doesn't soak your robes so much as persuade them to sag slightly. You follow the winding path into the village's outer quarter, where a modest tea house leans slightly to one side, as if tired of standing straight for so many years. The curtains are drawn, but inside, you hear soft voices and the rhythmic clink of ceramic cups. You slide open the door and step into warmth and steam. The scent of roasted barley tea wraps around you like a blanket. There, in the corner, not at the head table, not in the spotlight, sits Ietsuna. His sword leans against the wall behind him, untouched. In front of him, a cup of tea, a blank scroll, and a brush resting horizontally across the page like a sleeping cat. This tea house is no battlefield, and that's precisely why he loves it. In the noisy swirl of feudal life, taxes, war, honor duels, formal inspections. Thus, establishments became islands of quiet thought for samurai like Ietsuna. Here, hierarchy blurs. Merchants sit beside monks, poets debate carpenters, and a warrior can discuss seasonal metaphors without being asked how many heads he's collected. The tea master bows low and brings over 2 bowls of genmaicha, one for you, one for him. He doesn't speak at first. He just watches the steam rise, listens to the soft scrape of someone adjusting a cushion in the corner, and jots down a quick phrase. Even in stillness, rice crackles within the bowl, reminding of fire. This was where Ietsuna felt most at ease among low murmur, soft lighting, and warm tea bowls cupped between both hands. Some patrons knew who he was. Others assumed he was a scholar, or perhaps a temple scribe. It didn't matter. He never announced himself. The less attention he drew, the more clearly he could observe the world. Tea, for him, was not just a drink. It was ritual, meditation, a way to soften the sharp edges of the world. He believed that the way one poured water revealed more than a duel. Does your hand shake? He'd ask a student. Then your mind is too full. He admired the tea masters, especially those who came from modest backgrounds. They wielded no swords, commanded no armies, and yet had the power to silence a room with the angle of a teapot. That's true control, he once murmured to a friend, not the kind that forces quiet, but the kind that earns it. There's an account from a traveling scribe who happened to witness Ietsuna during one of these afternoons. The scribe noted that the samurai spent over 20 minutes choosing which ink to use, not because he was indecisive, but because he believed each hue resonated differently with different emotions. He finally chose a soft gray and used it to write a verse about fog on a mountain path. The scroll is lost, but the ink pot, now cracked and dulled with age, still sits in the tea house's back room. The owner doesn't advertise it. He just places a flower in it every morning. Always one. These quiet gatherings began to draw others like him, people tired of pretense, curious about stillness, unashamed of speaking softly. They formed no group, swore no oaths. They simply returned. A merchant who secretly carved haiku into driftwood, a retired soldier who painted insects with a single hairbrush, a noblewoman who wrote love letters to the moon but never sent them. Together, they created a kind of invisible society. No rules, no ranks, just an unspoken agreement that in this space, silence mattered, and beauty was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Historians still argue whether these tea house meetings had political undercurrents. After all, this was a period of factional tension. Could such gatherings of quiet minds be construed as rebellion? A few officials thought so. One tea house was raided, its patrons questioned for hours. But nothing seditious was found, just pages of poetry, drawings of cicadas, and one particularly detailed analysis of seasonal tofu pairings, if anything. The authorities were more bewildered than threatened. As one inspector wrote in his report, they speak of leaves as if they hold secrets. I suspect they're harmless. Still, Ietsuna remained cautious. He began rotating tea houses, never returning to the same one more than twice in a month. He encouraged others to do the same, not out of fear, but to preserve the sanctity of the experience. If we tread too often on the same grass, he said, we forget how soft it is. even in the tea house, he was teaching. One apprentice later recalled a day when Yatsuna asked everyone in the room to sit silently for 10 full minutes while watching a single drop of tea fall from a kettle's spout. The exercise was simple, the effect profound. I'd never noticed how heavy silence could be, the student wrote years later. It didn't crush, it revealed. Tea ceremony, in this context, became more than aesthetics. It was a training ground for the mind, precision without violence, attention without anxiety. In the crackle of the brazier, the dip of the ladle, the whisper of the brush on parchment, Yatsuna found more depth than in any battlefield strategy. One of the quirkiest habits he adopted during this period was naming his teacups, not fanciful names, no dragons or thunder, just quiet labels like evening read, two guests missing, or cloud with one leg. He claimed it helped him remember how each cup affected the flavor. But secretly, he treated each one like a character in a story he was writing in fragments, scattered across countless afternoons. Eventually, he started gifting them to guests, to students, to strangers who said something thoughtful without realizing it. The cup chooses, he'd say, smiling. No one ever refused. You didn't argue with the samurai who made silence into an art form, and so the tea house became both retreat and classroom, a place where swordplay melted into stillness, where the heat of the world was cooled by porcelain and powdered leaves. No shouts, no threats, just the soft, persistent sound of boiling water, and a man with calloused hands carefully folding his verse like it was something alive. Rain begins to patter on the roof tiles, not in a rush, but with that rhythmic patience only old buildings understand. You're back in Ietsuna's study, seated on the tatami mat, while he quietly cleans the blade of his katana, not from use, but from time. You notice something odd as he wipes the cloth down the curve of the blade. A piece of paper falls from inside the sheath. It flutters to the ground. You pick it up. A poem, short, stark, beautiful, written in a tight hand with deliberate brush pressure. The ink, though faded, still clings with pride. You blink. He smiles faintly. It's not the only one. He slides the sheath open once more and withdraws a handful of tiny scrolls, each delicately folded into the hollow cavity where oilcloth would normally be kept. You expect battle plans, perhaps instructions for a secret rendezvous, maybe even coded messages. But no, they're all verses. It started as a private joke, after years of being told that a samurai should carry death at his hip. Yatsuna decided to carry life instead, small poems, each one written in moments of quiet or observation, each one tucked into the most unexpected of places. A sheath, after all, is meant to protect. Why not protect softness? One poem reads, "Sword rests in silence, guarded by reeds and sparrows, its echo forgotten." Another, scribbled sideways on unusually coarse paper. To strike is easy, but to remain still while watched, that takes more courage. Over time, the scrolls multiplied, not just in his own blade, but in those of his students. They'd imitate the practice, inserting their own verses inside their scabbards or beneath the guards of their wakizashi. It was never officially taught. It simply became tradition, and not just among his students. Some messengers started folding poems into their satchels. Gardeners tucked verses into hollowed fence posts. One elderly retainer, upon his death, was found to have lined the entire inside of his armor with overlapping slips of poetry. Words, he believed, were better than padding. Historians still argue whether this practice ever influenced the broader samurai culture. Some scholars call it a curiosity, a fringe affectation limited to one poetic clan. Others suggest it quietly rippled out, especially among those samurai stationed far from courtly intrigues, men who saw less glory and more monotony, and who began to realize that words were easier to carry than burdens. There's a letter preserved in the archives of a northern temple, written by a guard stationed on a snowy mountain pass. In it, he writes, "I cannot match Ayetsuna Dono's verses, but I have begun to try. My fingers shake from cold, but when I write, they seem to remember fire." Yetsuna never claimed credit for this quiet movement. He rarely acknowledged it at all, but you could tell he noticed. He started writing smaller, folding more carefully, using tougher paper. "If it must travel far," he said once, "it should not tear in the rain." He also began adding calligraphy to the hilts of wooden practice swords, not decoration, not slogans, just single words, stillness, listening, wait. His philosophy, boiled into syllables and carved into the very tools of training. Visitors to his dojo found it strange at first. "What are they supposed to do with a sword that says 'Wait,' one puzzled lord asked. "Exactly," Ietsuna replied. This tension between action and restraint defined his style. He never discouraged strength, he simply reframed it. A powerful swing was less impressive than a controlled one. A strike that could land, but doesn't, carries more meaning than 1,000 completed ones. Even his most celebrated student, a samurai named Reiko, adopted this style fully. She became known not for her victories, but for how rarely she fought. She once stopped a raid simply by arriving early and reciting one of Ietsuna's poems to the local magistrate. The line, "A blade drawn too soon cuts more than it ever meant," including the self. Afterward, Ietsuna gave her his original inkstone. "You're going to need this more than a new sword," he said. One of the stranger artifacts to survive from this period is a formal military scroll with war plans outlined in great detail, but on the back of the parchment. Someone, likely Ietsuna, wrote a full seasonal sequence of poetry describing the movement of clouds, migration patterns of cranes, and the angle of rain on different roof tiles. No one knows why. Possibly he was bored. Possibly he thought that if anyone bothered to flip the scroll, they deserved a better reward than just troop movements. Some scholars argue that his scroll in the sheath habit was less about philosophy and more about safety. In a time when being caught with subversive material could lead to exile or worse, hiding his work in plain sight offered protection. Others insist it was a kind of spiritual talisman, words as an armor, but perhaps the simplest explanation is the truest. He liked knowing that beauty could be hidden where violence was expected, that if one reached for harm, they might instead find stillness. This small act, the folding of a poem inside a sword sheath, became his quiet rebellion. He never called it that. He simply continued doing it, long after his fingers began to tremble with age, long after his hair silvered, long after he stopped wearing armor outside ceremonies. Even in his final years, when his joints stiffened and his brush wobbled, he still wrote. His students would find little notes tucked inside door frames, under their teacups, folded into the sleeves of their practice robes. He never explained them, never signed them, but they always knew. Today, the wind smells like pine and wet stone. You follow Ayatsuna up a hill path, bordered by slanted lanterns and half-forgotten statues. His robe brushes the moss as he walks, slow but not hesitant, the way one might walk through a dream they visited many times before. The hill leads to an abandoned shrine, or rather, a neglected one, its roof patched with woven reeds, its offerings reduced to a few fading persimmons and a rust-streaked bell. This is not a place for prayers. This is a place for poems. Itsuna kneels, pulls a scroll from his sleeve, and places it gently before the altar. You expect incense or chanting. Instead, he murmurs a single-line stone fox. Guard my thoughts, but if they wander, forgive. Even moss forgets. It's not a prayer. Not really, it's a release. He's not alone, either. A young samurai stands nearby, nervous, armored, clearly carrying more emotion than comfort. His face twitches, as if he's preparing to speak, or perhaps to fight. But Yatsuna simply nods at him and gestures to the space beside the altar. The young man blinks, then reaches into his own sleeve and withdraws a thin slip of folded parchment. He lays it down with shaking fingers. No words are exchanged, only verses. This shrine has become a quiet ritual site for those few warriors who've learned to meet confrontation with creativity. It's not famous, it gets not even marked on most maps, but among a certain small circle of samurai, it has become known as Kotanzan, the hill of saying less. Once a month, Yatsuna comes here to leave a poem. Sometimes he brings guests, sometimes he comes alone. He never returns for his scrolls. They're left to the weather, to insects, to memory. A few have been preserved by curious monks from a nearby temple, but most have vanished, absorbed back into the landscape like breath into fog. One story persists about this place, one even he won't confirm. It's said that years ago, Yatsuna was approached by an enemy retainer bearing a challenge. The man was grieving the death of his brother in a border skirmish for which Ietsuna's clan was responsible. He had traveled 3 days to deliver the challenge personally, but rather than accept immediately, Ietsuna invited the man to walk with him to this shrine. They walked in silence. At the summit, Ietsuna did not speak. He handed the man a poem, then turned and left. The challenger stood there for over an hour. Eventually, he sat, pulled out his own brush, and wrote something back. Neither scroll survives, but according to the temple records, the retainer stayed in the area for 3 more days, visiting the shrine each morning, and then returned to his province without ever unsheathing his blade. Historians still debate whether this qualifies as a duel. Some argue it was the purest form, a clash not of weapons, but of grief and grace. Others claim it's all just folklore. The temple bell, however, is now engraved with 2 verses, one by Ietsuna, one by an anonymous hand. He later told a student, "There are 2 kinds of courage, the kind that rises and the kind that dissolves." This preference for dissolving conflict extended beyond the shrine in his daily life. Ietsuna became known for resolving disputes with unusual methods. When 2 cousins quarreled over inherited land, he suggested they each write a description of the property from memory, and then swap, reading how the others saw the same soil, the same trees, the same wind, softened them more effectively than any ruling ever could. When a stable boy was accused of theft, Yatsuna invited him to compose a verse about guilt. The boy's hands shook, his brush faltered, but the result was raw, sincere, full of rain imagery. Yatsuna said nothing. He read it, bowed, and said only thank you for telling the truth. The boy was never punished, nor did he steal again. This idea that poetry could replace punishment was radical, dangerous, even. Some elders feared it undermined order, but it's hard to argue with results. Fewer fights, fewer grudges, more time spent observing the world, and less time trying to dominate it. His detractors called it indulgent. His followers called it wise, even in martial instruction. He turned to words before weapons. Before beginning any new technique, he'd have students write a short description of the movement, not a diagram, a feeling, how the motion curved through the body, where the pause should be, what sound the feet might make. Only then would they practice. It was frustrating at first. Some complained, but those who stayed found themselves growing, not just stronger, but more perceptive. It's like learning to dance without music, one said, until you realize the silence is the rhythm. This approach, physicality guided by inner dialogue, became known, informally, as kata no kotoba, or form through words. It never spread widely. Too slow for most schools, too subtle for court tournaments. But it survived, tucked away in smaller dojos, passed down like an heirloom too fragile to display. One dojo still practices it today, hidden in a mountain village. The master refuses to use verbal commands. Every instruction comes written. Every session ends not with a bow, but with the reading of a single anonymous poem left on the mat. And though they never say his name, everyone knows who started it. Back at the shrine, the mist begins to roll in thicker. Yatsuna rises, knees cracking softly, and bows once more to the altar. He doesn't look back as he descends. You follow, watching his feet press into the wet earth still behind you. The two poems flutter slightly in the wind. No one will collect them, but someone, eventually, will read. You enter the clan estate's western corridor, where the wood floors creak a little more than they should, and the silence tastes heavier than usual. There are no servants bustling here, no sounds of tea being poured or documents being shuffled. This is the domain of judgment, the space where lineage weighs more than laughter. And silence is a language honed over generations. You follow Iatsuna into the chamber of his elders, where three clan officials sit with backs straighter than truth and expressions carved from old mountain stone. His father is among them, his face unreadable, not stern but not warm either. The scent of camphor wood hangs in the air like a warning. There's no crisis, not today, but there is disapproval. The topic is simple: Itsuna's behavior, his refusal to pursue a strategic marriage, his evasion of an official command position, his increasing influence outside the military chain of authority, and, perhaps most dangerous, his growing legend. He hasn't rebelled, he hasn't dishonored the clan, but he has become unpredictable, and in a world that values predictability above all, unpredictability can feel like a threat. The clan's senior counselor, Lord Tadamasa, opens the dialogue with practiced calm. Your name appears in more poems than records. Do you consider that balance appropriate for a warrior? Yatsuna bows deeply. A name in a poem must earn its place. He replies, a name in a record need only appear. The room tightens. Another elder, less patient, grumbles. You teach poetry as if it's a martial art. I do, Yatsuna answers, not defiantly, but as if confirming the color of the sky. His father remains silent. This is the hard part, not the disapproval, but the silence. Because in this room, silence doesn't mean peace. It means pressure. It means judgment suspended like a stone on a fraying rope. Yatsuna understands that. He's trained for it. He bows again, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. Then, before anyone can speak again, he reaches into his sleeve and offers something unexpected, a poem, not to flatter, not to appease, but to explain. Walls weigh down the wind, yet even here, breath will pass, soft, but not broken. He lays it on the floor before the elders and backs away. It's not protocol, it's not proper, but it works. No one speaks for a long while. Then, Lord Tadamasa sighs, a sound like an old robe falling from a hook. You're not disobedient, he murmurs. You're inconvenient. Yatsuna bows once more. I will accept that title with care. His father doesn't speak until the very end. When everyone else has left, he remains behind. The door slides closed. The shadows deepen. You could be a great general, he says. I'd rather be a good ancestor, Ayatsuna replies. His father does not bow, but he does not object either. In the months that follow, the pressure eases, but not because the clan approves of him, rather, because they begin to understand that trying to shape Yatsuna into someone else would break more than it would bend. They stop assigning him tasks he will clearly refuse. They stop suggesting betrothals to women who have never written a poem. Instead, they let him drift, like smoke from a censer, through the edges of their structure, not part of the core, but impossible to ignore. And still, he writes. Poems appear throughout the estate in strange places. One is found rolled into the hollow of a bamboo flute. Another, tucked inside the saddle blanket of a courier's horse. One particularly dry scroll is discovered in the charcoal box used to warm the tea water. The ink has faded from the heat, but the shape of the characters remains, like memories after time has erased the sound. These poems are not declarations. They are offerings to the stone pathways, to the cicadas screaming in summer, to the roof beams that creak in the wind, to the people who serve without being seen. One servant recalls opening a storage chest and finding a verse pinned to the underside of the lid. Not all who bow low do so out of fear or shame. Some just love the earth. This subtle poetry becomes his language of governance. He doesn't pass orders. He leaves poems. He doesn't reprimand. He composes. A blade is never drawn. And yet, things change and our arguments dissolve. A strained marriage is soothed by a verse left in a rice paper envelope on a windowsill. A land dispute is settled not by decree, but by a handwritten stanza passed between brothers. The field sees no names, only footsteps and new sprouts, season after season. Historians still debate whether Ietsuna's leadership was formal or accidental. Was he manipulating power with verse, or simply tending the garden of influence without seeking to harvest it? There's no clear answer. Some compare him to a calligrapher, who refuses commissions, but whose discarded practice sheets fetch fortunes. Others suggest his father finally saw the value of his approach, not because it brought honor, but because it brought calm. Even the clan accountant once admitted, our conflicts cost less in ink than they did in arrows. Still, not everyone's appreciated this shift. One visiting lord, upon reading one of Ayatsuna's poems pasted near the stables, scoffed. A sword dulls when not used, to which Ayatsuna, nearby and uninvited, replied softly, then perhaps it was never sharp to begin with, not a challenge, just an observation. But the Lord left early the next morning, in time. The elders stopped questioning his choices. They didn't embrace them, but they didn't interfere either. And sometimes, that's the most peace you can get in a world carved by expectation, by now. The clan had accepted that Iatsuna would not follow the normal arc of a samurai's career. He would not die in battle. He would not marry for alliance. He would not bark orders or chase titles. He would, instead, sit beneath trees, walk slowly through corridors, and leave behind pieces of himself too small to catalog and too meaningful to forget. His sword, untouched but not abandoned, remained in its stand, quiet, polished, and still, a symbol not of refusal, but of readiness. You climb the narrow trail beyond the last rice terrace, the sky overhead streaked with slow-moving clouds that look like the smudged remnants of forgotten scrolls. The mountain air is thinner here, crisp with pine resin and old stone. Ahead, Yatsuna moves at a steady pace, robes brushing the grass like a soft broom. He carries no sword today, only a small satchel filled with parchment, dried plums, and ink. This is his retreat, not an exile, not quite, but certainly a choice to step away, to vanish just a little. He comes here for weeks at a time, alone, to a wooden hermitage tucked into the hillside, where birds outnumber people and silence wears no shoes. The building itself is modest, roof patched with cedar bark, door held closed by a loop of braided vine. Inside, it smells of soot and straw mats, a futon, a writing desk, a kettle, that's all. Yet the room holds more calm than most palaces. Outside the window, a lotus pond, grown wild with weeds and dragonflies. And here, Iatsuna composes, not for court approval, not for students, not even for legacy, just for clarity. You watch as he kneels at the pond's edge, inkstone on his knee, and dips the brush. His gaze lingers not on the paper, but on a single frog poised on a lily pad. And then the verse comes, frog waits on green crown, pond holds its breath for the leap, but no splash arrives. He chuckles quietly. It's too proud, he says. It thinks it's basho here, away from clan obligations and social tension. Yatsuna lets his poetry change. The lines grow longer, the images stranger. One morning, you find him writing about the smell of thunder. Another, about the way bamboo shivers before wind touches it. These are not poems meant to be understood. They are poems meant to be inhabited. He once told a visitor, in the city, I wrote to explain. Here, I write to remember what needs no words. The retreat becomes more than a getaway. It becomes a sanctuary, not just for Iatsuna, but for those few who find their way up the mountain. They arrive quietly, often unannounced. Some stay an hour, others days. No one is turned away. The only rules speak less than you write. A merchant, exhausted by court politics, once left a bundle of his ledgers beside the door and spent the night cleaning the pond's edge. In return, Yatsuna gifted him a poem folded inside a reed. You carried numbers, but here, even stones are light. Rest, forget, begin. A widow came, seeking to burn a letter she could never send. Yatsuna offered her a brush, asked her to write something new, and then watched her ink a verse that ended with, I still speak to shadows, but now they nod back. He kept none of these. He did not archive, compile, or catalog. He simply read, bowed, and let the paper join the wind. Historians still argue whether these writings formed an early school of thought. Some call it a proto-Zen poetic tradition. Others suggest it was a kind of therapeutic exercise, a precursor to modern reflective journaling. A few cynics call it sentimentalism, dressed in formality. But those who visited knew better. They knew the retreat wasn't about escaping war or rejecting duty. It was about remembering quiet, about choosing softness, not because the world is kind, but because someone needs to be. Even his sword, brought once to the hermitage and placed on a shelf, seemed out of place here. It remained wrapped in silk, untouched for years, its lacquered sheath collecting a dust so fine it shimmered when sunlight found the window. He never opened it, but he dusted it once a week, reverently, like one would care for an old musical instrument whose tune was no longer needed but never forgotten. One visitor, a disillusioned court poet, once asked, don't you fear they'll erase you, that you'll be remembered as soft, or worse, irrelevant? Yatsuna's reply was quiet. If memory needs blood to endure, it was never worth the stain. Some of the most treasured poems from this period never made it back down the mountain. They were written on leaves, on bark, on flat stones. One particularly rainy week, he composed an entire sequence on scraps of silk and left them hanging from trees like forgotten prayers. A wandering monk gathered a few before the wind stole the rest. One fragment survives. I am not the wind, but I've asked it to carry what I could not say. This was also the period in which Yatsuna developed a strange new habit, writing poems backward. Not to confuse, but to test his own commitment. If I can read the truth in reverse, he explained, perhaps I finally understand it. Later scholars would decode one such backward verse, scrawled on the inside lid of his inkstone box. No name survives wind, but the scent of ink lingers longer than stone walls. There were still duties, of course, letters from the clan, quiet requests to return for ceremonies, to offer guidance, to help resolve disputes. He answered when he could, sometimes with presence, sometimes with verse, but he never stayed away too long, just long enough to refill his spirit, the way a kettle refills with rainwater if left beneath a leak. And when he descended the mountain, robes a little more faded, beard a little longer, heart steadier, he brought no trophies, just silence, and perhaps a new poem folded in his sleeve. You return to the lowlands with him now, passing through misty fields and humming paddies where frogs compete in echoing croaks. He walks slower than before, but not from age. He's simply watching more closely. The arch of a reed bending under dew, the smear of blue in a dragonfly's wing. His gaze has grown more patient, as if everything in the world might eventually whisper a poem, if only observed long enough. Back at the estate, a new habit has emerged. Letters arrive, not from officials, not from relatives, but from scattered individuals, Across the provinces, young samurai, aging monks, disgruntled scribes who have somehow heard of Ietsuna's reputation. They've heard not about battles or honors, but about poems hidden in scabbards, verses left in tea houses, and scrolls fluttering from mountain trees. And they write, not for favors, not for strategy. They write to share, to ask, to offer. The letters aren't always graceful. Some contain little more than fragmented thoughts or attempts at verse. Others come packed with emotion, frustration at the cruelty of their training masters, sorrow over comrades lost, confusion about how to live in a world where obedience is demanded and softness mocked. Yatsuna reads everyone, and he replies, not with advice, not with lectures, but with poems, short, patient, intimate. He doesn't correct. He responds in kind, answering fear with quiet affirmation and bitterness with wordless empathy. Sometimes he includes a drawing, a single ginkgo leaf, a rabbit looking skyward, a cracked tea bowl stitched with gold. It's an invisible network, no name, no membership, but slowly it grows. Letters begin arriving from women who've secretly been writing poetry while forbidden to read it, from children copying kanji into the dirt and wondering if that counts as art, from retired fighters who finally feel the ache they ignored for decades and don't know what to do with it. One writes, I broke 3 ribs once, but they healed, but this hollowness won't close like the rest. Yatsuna sends back, not every wound seals. Some are meant to hold quiet, like a bowl for rain. He never publishes these exchanges. He never seeks recognition. But some of his replies are copied, quietly shared, sometimes slipped into the sleeves of travelers or pinned to trees along pilgrim roads. A few even end up stitched into banners flown outside rural temples. His words begin to move without him. Historians still argue whether this constituted a movement. Some say yes, that Ietsuna founded a kind of poetic resistance to the stoicism expected of the samurai class. Others insist it was simply correspondence, magnified by myth. One scholar dubs it the quiet thread, pointing to the dozens of scroll fragments discovered in roadside inns, abandoned shrines, and lacquered boxes tucked into private collections, most unsigned, all written in a style unmistakably his. There's one especially curious episode. A group of samurai in the distant north, stationed on a snowy border, began composing poems nightly during winter watch. Their commander, a fan of Yetsuna's writing, implemented the practice in place of formal reporting. Each man must write, he ordered, not what he sees, but what he feels in the dark. One scroll from this unit reads, Snow has weight like war, but beneath it, pine needles still remember green. The commander retired early, not for scandal, for peace. When asked how he came to such an unorthodox leadership style, he simply said, I read something once, and then I listened. Even within Yetsuna's own region, the effect becomes clear. Young retainers begin quoting poems instead of proverbs. Court scribes take extra care in brushstroke spacing, claiming that how it feels to write it matters as much as what it says. One weapons master even begins training students to breathe in rhythm with seasonal imagery, exhaling like wind in winter, inhaling like new leaves in spring. Not everyone approves. Some call it distraction, others delusion. But no one can deny that tempers ease, fists lower, silences deepen. Yetsuna, for his part, remains modest, He doesn't speak of influence. He simply continues to write. Sometimes he writes a response the moment a letter arrives. Other times he waits days, watching the moon's path across his study wall, listening to frogs, testing the sound of a brush on dry parchment before committing to ink. And not all replies are hopeful. He allows for melancholy, for ambiguity, for the simple truth that not all things resolve. To a grieving father, he sends the child is gone, yes, but their steps still press the dust when you walk at dusk. To a warrior questioning his own rage, anger tastes like steel, but even that melts with time. Ask the rusted blade. This openness, this refusal to force clarity, becomes his hallmark. He never claims wisdom, he only offers observation. And perhaps that's why his words reach so far, not as commands, but as invitations. He once told a visitor, "Poetry is not a mirror, it's a paper door. You walk through, and suddenly the world sounds different as his replies multiply. He begins using different inks for different moods, burnt umber for sorrow, indigo for clarity, vermilion for verses meant to be read aloud beneath lanterns. He even begins shaping his brush tips differently, clipping them into irregular forms to change how the ink flows. Sometimes beauty needs uneven hands, he says, showing a student a brush shaped like a willow twig. One of the few existing collections of his work from this time was compiled not by him, but by recipients, passed from hand to hand. The scroll eventually reached a small archive in the port city of Nagasaki. It remains unsigned, catalogued only as verses of the Reed Road. Yatsuna never mentions it, but he once smiled when asked whether he recognized the title. That road, he said, was always walked by many feet. I just left the footprints crooked enough to notice. The afternoon sun filters through slatted shutters, casting striped shadows across the garden floor. You sit quietly beside Yatsuna, the two of you watching koi swirl through the pond in lazy spirals, their movements more like drifting calligraphy than anything urgent. The air hums with the low buzz of cicadas and the faint clack of bamboo in the wind. He dips his brush into ink, pauses, and then doesn't write. Not yet. He's watching. The frogs are silent today. He murmurs. They must be listening to each other. This garden is not grand. No ornate lanterns, no sculpted pines, just reeds, stones, water, and time. And yet, it has become one of Ietsuna's most cherished places, because here, nothing is expected to be more than what it is. Even a bent twig or a crooked tile is left alone, trusted to be quietly beautiful without adjustment. He writes most of his poems here now, not from inspiration, but from reflection, a way to settle what already sits quietly within. And increasingly, he composes letters not to respond, but to begin. Verses sent to those he's never met, to temples he's never visited, to artisans he'll never see again. One scroll, later discovered at a modest pottery shop in Aga province, simply read, "You shaped wet clay once," and someone far down the road now cradles warm tea. He begins keeping a basket by the gate. Those who pass by, travelers, messengers, servants, may reach in and take one scroll. No questions asked. Some contain poems. Some are blank. Some offer a single question, handwritten in his fine, slanted hand. What does stillness sound like to you? The answers never return. But that, too, is part of the process. This practice soon finds its way into town life. A baker begins slipping verses into loaves of bread. A basket weaver knots stanzas into her reed patterns. A ferryman in the capital city paints haiku on the underside of his oars. Not because anyone told them to, because something about Yetsuna's method gave them permission. Permission to be soft, to be quiet, to say something without demanding to be heard. Not all of it goes smoothly. One merchant is mocked for writing poetry on his rice sacks. Another is fined for defacing government property after chalking a verse on a town gate. Still, the movement persists, not organized, not named, just there, like moss at the edge of rooftops, growing slowly, even under scrutiny. There's one story from this time that resurfaces again and again: a swordsmith, old and stubborn, who had never once written a poem. He considered such things frivolous. But one evening, after delivering a repaired blade to Ietsuna, he finds a slip of parchment tucked under the handle if steel holds silence. Then it has heard many screams and survived all of them. The swordsmith says nothing, but a week later, he leaves a folded note outside Ietsuna's door. Inside, I only strike once, but the heat still hums softly, long after the blade. From then on, he signs every finished sword with a single engraved kanji shizuka, silence, Yetsuna, for all his reach. Never tries to shape these responses, he only observes. He once described them as echoes made of paper. Some he kept, most he didn't. He claimed the best ones vanished into the hands of people who needed them more. Around this time, his own writing changes again. The structure of his verses loosens. The syllables drift, less concerned with meter and more focused on sensation. A poem might stretch longer than expected, or stop halfway through, as if forgetting itself was part of the meaning. One fragment, found on a woodblock, reads: "The wind forgot my name, but remembered my scent. So I followed." A younger cousin asks him once, "How do you know when a poem is finished?" He smiles, chewing a pickled plum. "When I stop needing it, by now." Even members of the court, some quietly, others reluctantly, begin to echo his tone. One lord issues his land decrees with poetic metaphors. Another delivers battle instructions in verse form to lighten the mood. Ietsuna doesn't comment on this imitation. He simply sends a scroll to each of them. Written with great care and gentle cheek, a shadow pretends, but the tree does not mind it, so neither will I. Still, despite the imitation, no one quite captures the balance. He maintains humility without self-erasure, elegance without pomp. His words do not ask for attention. They ask for quiet. And somehow, they always get it. He begins spending more time with children, not formally, not in lessons. He simply sits near the temple garden where they gather, watching them catch bugs, chase paper fans, laugh over broken sandals. Occasionally, one brings him a leaf or a rock or a drawing. He responds with a poem, always brief, always handwritten, always sincere. One child draws a cloud with 4 legs. Yetsuna writes back, "Sky horse, gallop slow, or you'll scatter too many petals on the breeze." The child laughs for a week. This small cycle of exchange spreads among the nearby villages. Eventually, children begin leaving offerings outside his door: bent flowers, wrinkled pages, tiny carvings. He keeps them all, not because he needs them, because they were made with still hands. And that in his mind, is the highest praise. He once wrote, "If the world is loud, then let my name be a breeze passing through soft trees." He never explains it, but he folds it and places it inside his robe, close to his chest. You suspect he carries it everywhere. The storm came in slowly, first as a hush, then as a tremble in the shutters, and finally as a full-bodied breath of thunder rolling across the horizon. You're in Ietsuna's study when the wind begins tugging at the paper screens. He doesn't flinch. He simply places a weight atop the scroll he's working on and turns to the window, watching the sky as if it were reciting something old and half-remembered. But this time, the weather isn't what unsettles him. It's the scroll on his desk, longer than usual, words written with more pressure, less air between the lines. A poem that's different, more urgent, less like a reflection and more like a declaration. It begins, "They will burn this ink, but not before it sings once. A flame is still light." This is the forbidden scroll. You don't know all of its contents. No one truly does. But you know the whispers around it. That it spoke directly of cruelty within the ranks of a powerful clan. That it described the way silence is weaponized. How honor becomes armor for injustice. How obedience can fracture the soul. It didn't name names. It didn't need to. It was written not for rebellion, but for honesty. But honesty, when sharp, cuts in places even swords cannot reach. He never intended it to spread. It was meant for one recipient, a former student now serving under a harsh regime, someone Ietsuna hoped might recognize himself and remember the gentleness he once lived by. But the scroll was copied, first in secret, then in silence, then in fragments passed from hand to hand, inked onto fans, stitched into sleeves, smuggled inside books. The original vanished, but the words multiplied. The final verse, especially, began appearing in unlikely places when no voice remains. "Leave the truth in falling leaves. They still reach the ground," officials noticed. Quietly, without fanfare, an order was issued: destroy every copy, punish the source. But the source couldn't be found, because the words had already melted into memory. Still, suspicion fell where it always does. One evening, a retainer from a rival house arrived unannounced, requesting to search Ietsuna's quarters. The man was polite, but persistent. Ietsuna welcomed him in, served him tea, and sat silently as the man rifled through scrolls and shelves, opening drawers, unrolling poems, tapping walls for hidden compartments. He found nothing. But before he left, Ietsuna offered him a folded parchment. The man hesitated, then accepted. The scroll read, "You are not my foe, but you've been given sharp shoes and told how to walk." The retainer left pale-faced and never returned. Historians still argue over the content of the forbidden scroll. No complete copy survives, only fragments, paraphrased by later poets or referenced in faded temple margins. Some claim it criticized the entire structure of the samurai code. Others say it was a love poem disguised as dissent. A few fringe scholars believe it was Ietsuna's resignation, a formal farewell to the warrior life, written not in ink, but in ash. There's even a theory that the scroll never existed, and the legend was born from a combination of envy, mystery, and fear of a man whose influence arrived quietly and left no footprints. But then there's the artifact, locked in a drawer at a coastal monastery, kept without label, guarded without explanation, is a scroll case containing 7 burned scraps of silk, each with partially legible kanji. One word, yureru, to tremble, appears on 3. Another, muku, to shed, to release, appears twice. One scholar who viewed the fragments described them as verses written by someone who loved beauty too much to let it lie. The monastery refuses to display the fragments publicly. They weren't meant to last, the abbot once explained, but they were meant to echo back in his study. Yatsuna quietly closes the window against the wind. He doesn't mention the scroll. He never denies it. But that night, he lights no lamp. He simply sits in the dark, listening to the storm scratch at the shutters like an impatient memory. You sit beside him. No words, no questions. Eventually, he speaks, more to the darkness than to you. There are poems that are lanterns, he says, and poems that are flint. Then silence again. But the next morning, he writes. He doesn't stop, if anything. He writes more, verses folded into kitchen drawers, inked onto the rims of teacups, brushed onto discarded wood. He does not retreat. He does not harden. He simply continues. And while others grow cautious, he becomes freer, more lyrical, less guarded. One scroll from this time reads, "The inkwell is cracked, but still it holds morning rain. What more could I need?" Another. Found later beneath a garden stone, truth wears no armor, but still, it walks unshaken, leaf by fragile leaf, if the scroll was his risk. These new poems are his return to rhythm, not denial, but defiance through softness. A reminder that fragility is not failure. It is a kind of resistance all its own, and so, his name lives, rarely shouted, often whispered, spoken in tea houses, tucked into the last pages of hand-bound journals, etched faintly into the wood beams of old dojos. Not because he fought, but because he didn't. The air is cool this morning, the kind that makes your joints whisper as you move and coaxes the scent of old wood out from every crack in the beams. Yatsuna stands at the garden gate, unusually still, his hand resting on the hilt of a sword that hasn't been drawn in decades. But this time, something is different. Today, he will unsheath it, not for war, not for vengeance, but for protection. It begins with footsteps, frantic, urgent, echoing down the path from the village. A young girl bursts through the gate, breath ragged, cheeks streaked with tears. She clutches a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside, broken pottery, a handful of poems, and a calligraphy brush snapped in half. She doesn't need to explain. He already knows. A traveling magistrate, new, ambitious, and eager to make his mark, has accused her family of subversive writing. Her older brother, a student of Yatsuna's, has been taken for questioning. Their home searched, her verses burned. Yatsuna listens, then bows, then moves. There's no ceremony, no grand declarations. He doesn't summon his students, doesn't ask permission, doesn't even change clothes. He lifts the sword from its stand, still wrapped in its original cloth, and walks down the hill. You follow. It's the first time you've seen him carry the blade like this, openly, confidently, but with none of the flourish warriors often adopt. He doesn't posture, he simply walks, like a monk bearing water, like a poet bearing truth. The road curves past rice paddies and watchtowers. Villagers watch in silence. They know his name, know his presence, and know that something serious must be unfolding. One old man whispers, the quiet one's finally making noise. At the village gate, he's stopped by guards, young, bored, unprepared. They eye the sword warily. I seek the magistrate, Yatsuna says. His voice is calm, and too calm. One guard flinches. They let him pass. The magistrate is in the courtyard, surrounded by papers, inkstones, confiscated scrolls. He's young, sharp, dressed in robes a shade too elaborate for this province. He greets Iatsuna with forced politeness, the way one greets a wolf that hasn't bared its teeth. To what do I owe the honor, he asks. Iatsuna bows, to offer correction, and then, for the first time in 40 years, he draws his sword. It doesn't sing. It doesn't gleam. It simply exists, at his side, real, solid. The magistrate stiffens. Is that a threat? Number Iatsuna replies. It's punctuation. The silence that follows is not empty. It is full of tension, of disbelief, of memory. Iatsuna lays the sword flat on the table between them. You've mistaken fragility for weakness, he says. You've confused silence with consent. These scrolls, he gestures to the pile, are not weapons, but you treat them as if they are. The magistrate starts to speak. Iatsuna cuts him off, not with the blade, but with a verse. You fear the soft voice, because it doesn't need noise to reshape the room. One of the magistrate's aides stifles a gasp. No one moves. Finally, Yatsuna sheathes the sword, slowly, deliberately. Then he turns and walks away, leaving the weapon behind, resting on the magistrate's table like a sealed question. The next morning, the brother is released. The poems are returned. The sword is respectfully delivered back to the estate by a messenger who says nothing and bows so low his forehead touches the mat. Yatsuna places the blade on its stand and never touches it again. Historians still debate this moment. Was it performance protest proof that peace, when disrupted, has sharp edges? Some say the sword wasn't even sharpened. Others insist it hadn't dulled. One particularly poetic scholar wrote, "It mattered less whether the blade could cut, and more that it was carried by someone who chose not to." The event quickly passed into rumor. Some say the magistrate left the province the next season, embarrassed. Others claim he stayed and changed, quietly funding calligraphy schools and preserving banned texts under assumed names. The records are inconclusive, but one fact remains for weeks afterward. Verses began to appear in public spaces, written on doors, carved into fence posts, etched into lacquerware. Not Yatsuna's verses, theirs, the people's. Words that had been trembling behind teeth for years, now walking openly in ink. And Iatsuna, he never spoke of the event again, but in the garden, a new stone appeared, smooth, black, unmarked, save for a single character carved deeply into its surface. 2. The kanji for sword, sus, but also for way. The dual meaning wasn't lost on his students. One asked him, weeks later, what he'd been thinking in that moment, when he placed the sword between them, when he chose to stand rather than bow, to speak rather than simply observe. He answered with a shrug, and then said, "Even silence must learn when to press its thumb on glass, just to leave a trace." Lanterns flicker along the walkways now, their soft gold glow trembling in the evening breeze. The air has cooled, but not sharply, just enough to make you notice the warmth radiating from stone steps and cupped tea bowls. You sit beneath the eaves, beside Ietsuna, watching the shadows stretch like long brushstrokes across the garden gravel. He hums quietly an old song, wordless, forgotten by most, remembered by fingers alone. He is older now, not frail, but settled. His hair has gone silver at the edges. His robes hang more loosely, but his eyes remain unchanged, steady, amused, unshaken by noise, fame, once an unwelcome breeze brushing against the edges of his life, now sits squarely in his lap, and somehow it still doesn't seem to interest him. The strange thing is, he's never been more popular. Letters continue to arrive, now from scholars, artists, and even former generals. Some request mentorship, others request explanation. Most simply want to thank him for a verse, a silence, a decision not made. His name, once spoken only in side halls and quiet tea houses, now echoes in places he's never visited: court libraries, village schools, shipping manifests where crates are stamped with fragments of his verses. Some call him a sage, others a philosopher, one poet, too drunk to pronounce anything properly, referred to him as the ink saint. He doesn't argue, but he doesn't engage either. Instead, he spends more time watching the sky. One afternoon, while observing cranes spiral in lazy arcs above the fields, he whispers, "They circle without maps, and still they arrive each year. Maybe we do too." He no longer teaches formally, but people still gather. They come for conversations that rarely reach conclusions. They come for walks that have no destination. They come to sit in silence beside him, hoping that something will arise, not an answer, but a moment, and often it does. A student once asked, "What is the purpose of poetry?" Ietsuna answered with a question, "What is the purpose of breathing?" No one asked again. A local lord arrives one day, full of formality and stiff with obligation. He bows, offers a lacquered box containing a decorative sword with gold leaf and mother of pearl inlays. "A gift," the lord says, "to honor your restraint." Ietsuna examines it, then says, "It's too loud." The lord laughs, uncertain if it's a joke. He later finds the sword displayed in the outhouse, not in mockery, simply placed where no one will look too long. In truth, Ietsuna has always been more interested in impermanence. Fame, honors, commemorations, they're heavy. His life is light. In his later years, his poetry changes again. It becomes more spacious. Lines that feel like pauses rather than statements. One, found written in water on a stone slab. "Do not carve this verse. It already lives in you. Let it fade with breath." He also begins collecting mistakes, not as failures, but as treasures. Cracked cups, miswritten kanji, ink blots. He claims each reveals something that perfection cannot. A favorite piece in his collection is a scroll with one line scratched out so many times the paper tore. He keeps it pinned to his wall. When asked why, he says, "Because I didn't give up on the page, and the page didn't give up on me." He's offered positions. Again, court poet, cultural advisor, head of a newly proposed academy for warrior poets. Each one declined with the same gentle phrase, "My work doesn't scale well." That line itself becomes quoted across provinces. He doesn't mind. He just shakes his head when told. "I meant it literally." He says, "I don't own enough ink." In these twilight years, he begins writing poems not for others, but for objects. He pins verses inside cupboards, scribbles them on the handles of garden tools, tucks them beneath roof tiles, each one a blessing, a farewell, a whisper, one pinned to the back of a wooden ladle. You stirred so softly, the broth never feared burning. I learned from that. It's also during this time that a collection of his poems finally makes its way to a publisher. Not through him, through a former student who gathered them quietly, seeking no permission and offering no credit. The scroll is titled Lantern Smoke. It becomes a minor success, quiet but lasting, copied in secret, banned in one province, smuggled into another. Eventually, it reaches the court. A poem from the collection words do not end war, but they build the bridge you cross when the sword is dull. The collection isn't seen as political, not exactly, but it is seen as a shift, a nudge, a demonstration that influence doesn't always roar, it sometimes hums. Back at home, Yatsuna keeps no copy. He says, I already lived those poems. Why carry them twice as lanterns grow more common across villages, replacing torches and bonfires? Someone begins the tradition of whispering poems while lighting them. Not written verses, just remembered fragments, murmured into the flame. Most never knew where the tradition came from, but some suspect, and in one distant town, during the Mid-Autumn Festival, a boy lights his family's lantern and softly says, May it float like breath, soft enough to move the dark, bright enough to wait. No one tells him to stop. You wake to the scent of rain on dry wood and the gentle creak of someone opening a paper screen. Yatsuna moves through the house slowly now, not from weakness, but from habit. Each step is deliberate, each gesture unhurried. His presence has grown softer with time, but somehow more expansive, like ink spreading slowly across thick parchment. He does not speak much these days. He listens, even more than before. When someone visits, and they still do, quietly, in steady numbers, he offers tea, a cushion, a folded scroll, sometimes a poem, sometimes a question, rarely both. He claims words are too heavy to stack more than one layer deep. He spends most of his mornings by the lotus pond. He no longer writes every day, but when he does, the lines come so lightly they barely leave a mark. The strokes are thinner, more like breath than brush. One recent poem reads, Even the soft wind does not remember its path, only that it came. The scrolls from this period are fewer, more fragile. Some are written on old receipts, others on the backs of practice calligraphy sheets, others still on leaves pressed between panes of glass. He has stopped caring about permanence altogether. Everything important, he murmurs once, already knows how to vanish. His health remains stable, no collapse, no sudden frailty, just a slow tapering of hunger, of urgency, of need. He eats less, sleeps more, pauses longer before speaking, sometimes forgets what season it is, then writes a poem that proves he never really forgot. One evening, as clouds gather at the edge of the sky and cicadas quiet in anticipation of rain, he invites you for a walk through the village. No destination, no message to deliver. He simply wants to listen to the stones shift beneath his feet. Along the way, children greet him, merchants bow. An old student places a hand on his shoulder without saying a word. He nods in return and continues walking. The sword still rests in its place at home, polished, undisturbed. It hasn't moved since that day in the magistrate's courtyard, but his brush, worn to a stump, still lies beside his pillow. That night, he sits at his desk once more and begins what feels like a final verse, not because of its tone, but because of its weightlessness, as though the words had been waiting somewhere in the rafters for decades, and only now drifted down. If I fade tonight, tell the wind I listened well, even in silence. He places the scroll on the windowsill and leaves the window open, just enough for the breeze to carry it away if it chooses to. The next morning, he doesn't rise early. He simply doesn't rise. His body is found seated, head resting gently against the post of the window frame, as though pausing mid-thought. The ink in his pot is dry, the brush still faintly damp. A cicada buzzes once, then stops. There is no ceremony, no grand procession. He is buried with no sword, only a sealed envelope, left in his sleeve, addressed to no one in particular. Inside, a single line: "Thank you for letting me whisper in the years that follow." His poems are gathered, not by scholars, but by potters, monks, children, and tea-house owners. They appear in unlikely places, scratched onto fishing boats, sewn into traveling cloaks, whispered at weddings and funerals. No single anthology is ever considered complete, because the truth is, he didn't leave a collection. He left a conversation, one that still drifts quietly through the world, paper thin, but sharp enough to change the shape of things. Even now, in the hush before sleep, you might hear it. Just listen. And now, let it all soften. Let the sword rest in its stand. Let the ink dry in its little bowl. Let the verses we've carried and the quiet we've witnessed drifted down like petals after bloom. There is no more to explain, no lesson to extract, only a sense of slow breath settling. The soft-spoken samurai is gone from the path now. His footsteps long absorbed into the earth. His scrolls folded into the hands of strangers who didn't know him, but understood him anyway. The pond is still, the brush is quiet, and somewhere, out beyond the fields, a paper lantern flickers one last time before the wind remembers to blow. You've walked long tonight, through mountain fog, garden stillness, ink-stained silence, and the gentle creak of choices made without pride. You've sat beneath his eaves, watched his blade stay sheathed, and felt his words slip into the places armor never reaches. Let that be enough. Let it stay simple. You don't have to remember every poem, just the hush they left behind, just the feeling of not needing to raise your voice to be heard, just the thought that maybe gentleness is not the absence of strength, but the most refined version of it. Close your eyes now. The sword has sung, the scroll has curled at its edges, and the wind knows the rest. Sleep, and let your breath fall into rhythm with the reeds. You are safe. The quiet remains.